You still up? It's just Simone's stuff.
Was Dana Whitfield, standing outside her own guest room at 11 at night, looking at a toothbrush that had no business being there, and a husband who was already explaining it before she'd asked a single question. Before I tell you what Dana found out over the weeks that followed, if you love stories about the quiet unraveling of something everyone else assumed was solid, and the moment the person at the center of it finally stops pretending not to notice, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because what Dana did with what she found is not what her husband was counting on. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. And while you're down there, has a small detail ever told you something was wrong before you had any proof at all? Tell me about it. Now, let's go back to where this really started. Dana Whitfield was 44 years old, married 4 years to a man named Marcus, a project manager at a mid-sized logistics company. And for most of those 4 years, if you'd asked her, she would have told you without hesitation that she'd built exactly the kind of life she used to picture as a girl. Steady, unremarkable, in the best possible way, the kind of ordinary most people spend their whole lives chasing without ever saying so out loud. They dated 3 years before marrying in a small backyard ceremony, settled into a 2-story house in a quiet HOA neighborhood outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and Dana kept building her career at a marketing firm downtown, steady in the way her whole life had always been steady. The guest room had been Dana's project the year before all of this started. A full weekend spent painting the walls the color of soft sage, mostly so her mother, who visited twice a year and always complained about hotel beds, would have somewhere comfortable to stay. Marcus mentioned a coworker named Simone in passing one Tuesday evening over dinner, the kind of mention that was almost too casual to register at the time. "She's going through a rough breakup," he said, stirring his pasta without quite looking up. "Landlord's selling the building, and she's got nowhere lined up yet. I told her she could crash in our guest room for a couple weeks while she sorts it out." Dana, who genuinely believed in helping people through hard stretches, and who had, more than once, taken in a friend of a friend without a second thought, said, of course, without hesitating. If she was honest with herself later, there was one small thing that struck her as slightly odd. Even in that first conversation, she'd worked in the same city as Marcus's company for years, and had been to exactly 2 of his office holiday parties, and she couldn't remember him ever mentioning a Simone before that Tuesday. But it was such a small, forgettable detail at the time that she didn't think to hold on to it. People had coworkers they didn't talk about at home constantly. That was normal. That was nothing. Simone moved in that weekend with 2 suitcases and a box of books, thanked Dana warmly at the door, complimented the sage green paint specifically, and for the first several days seemed exactly like what she'd been described, as quiet, a little sad, gone early for work and back late, careful not to leave dishes in the sink or overstay her welcome in the shared spaces of the house. Dana, if anything, felt a little proud of herself for how smoothly it was going, the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from being the sort of person who helps without making a production of it. It was the 3rd week that the small things started, and even then, none of them arrived all at once. It was the 3rd week that the small things started. A different brand of toothbrush appeared in the guest bathroom cup, one Dana hadn't bought and didn't remember Simone bringing in with her. She almost mentioned it out loud, then decided it was such a small thing that mentioning it would have felt strange, even a little paranoid. Marcus started staying a little later at the office some evenings, always with a reasonable explanation attached, a deadline, a client call that ran long, nothing that on its own deserved a second thought. And one night, coming down for water around midnight, Dana passed the guest room and heard Marcus's voice on the other side of the closed door, low, laughing easily at something, at an hour when he was supposed to already be asleep beside her. She stood in the hallway for a moment longer than she meant to, one hand resting lightly against the wall, before turning around and going back to bed without knocking, telling herself there was nothing strange about a husband checking in on a stressed-out coworker before bed. She told herself it was nothing, more than once, in more than one version. He was probably just checking in on a stressed-out coworker, being kind the way she'd always liked about him, the same quality that had made her say yes to dinner 7 years earlier without needing to think it over. But some nights, lying awake next to an empty space where Marcus should have been, she found herself doing math she didn't want to be doing. How many of his late nights lined up with nights? Simone had also mentioned working late over dinner, How the two of them always seemed to laugh at the same jokes at the table, a half second before anyone bothered explaining the joke to her. Small, private laughter that passed between them, like a language she hadn't been taught. There was a Sunday morning, a few weeks into all of this, when Dana walked into the kitchen and found Marcus and Simone already there, coffee made, some easy conversation trailing off the moment she appeared in the doorway. Nothing about it was dramatic. Nobody jumped apart or looked guilty. It was the opposite, somehow, that unsettled her more, the total, practiced ease of it, like a scene that had been happening every Sunday morning for a while and simply hadn't required her presence until now. Simone herself never gave Dana much to work with directly. She remained polite in every interaction, thanked her for small things, asked once, with what seemed like genuine sincerity, how Dana's work presentation had gone that week. It was, in a strange way, the politeness that Dana found hardest to sit with. It would have been simpler, almost, if Simone had been cold or dismissive, something easier to justify suspecting. Instead, she was pleasant in exactly the way a person is pleasant towards someone they've decided not to think too hard about. And Dana found herself watching that pleasantness the way she might watch a weather pattern, waiting to see which direction it would eventually break. If you had a nagging feeling about someone you loved, and every single piece of evidence on its own could still be explained away, would you trust the feeling or the explanations? Let me know below, because Dana was about to stop explaining things away, and what she found over the next 6 weeks was worse than anything she'd let herself imagine. Dana didn't confront anyone that first week she started paying real attention. She told herself she was simply being observant, not suspicious, a distinction that felt important to her at the time, even if she couldn't have fully explained why it mattered so much to keep believing it, or who exactly she thought she was protecting by keeping it. She started noticing the pattern in Marcus's calendar app, shared with her since their wedding, mostly out of convenience for coordinating dinners and weekend plans. Client dinners that never quite matched client names she recognized from 4 years of hearing him talk about work. A recurring Thursday evening block, simply labeled Logistics Review, that had started the exact same week Simone moved in. The credit card statement arrived the following week, same as it always did, and Dana almost didn't open it that night, tired from a long day at work. But something made her sit down at the kitchen table and actually read through the charges line by line instead of skimming for the total the way she usually did. A dinner charge from a restaurant downtown on a night Marcus had told her he was working late. A hotel charge, one night only, dated the same week Simone had mentioned a work conference that, as far as Dana could tell, didn't actually exist on the calendar anywhere. She sat with the statement a long time, running her finger down the same 3 lines over and over, before finally photographing each one on her phone and adding the dates to her notebook. She started keeping a small notebook of her own, not accusations, just observations, dates, and small details, the way a person keeps a record of something they're not yet ready to say out loud even to themselves. Late night, guest room lights still on at 1 a.m. Simone left early Saturday, came back Sunday evening, no explanation given. Marcus canceled our anniversary dinner reservation, said work emergency. Was seen by my coworker Grace at a restaurant downtown with someone matching Simone's description. There was one night, about a month into the notebook, when Dana almost said something. Marcus came home a little after 10, and she was sitting in the living room with the television on low, not really watching it, and the question rose up in her so suddenly and so fully formed that she actually opened her mouth to ask it, "Where were you?" Really? Tonight before something made her close it again. Maybe it was fear of the answer. Maybe it was some instinct telling her the notebook wasn't finished yet, that asking too early would only hand him the chance to explain his way around whatever she'd already noticed. Whatever it was, she said goodnight instead and went to bed and lay there hating herself a little for the silence, even as she told herself it was strategy, not cowardice. She hated how calm she managed to stay through all of it, actually. Some nights she wondered if that calm was its own kind of proof that some part of her had already known for longer than she wanted to admit, and had simply been waiting for enough evidence to stop being able to argue herself out of it. She thought, more than once, about her own mother, who'd stayed married to a man for 11 years past the point everyone else around her could see clearly, everyone except her, and Dana promised herself, quietly, in the dark, that she wasn't going to be the last person in the room to know the truth about her own life. 2 weeks later, she called Grace, her closest friend since college, and a paralegal who, as it happened, had walked more than one other friend through exactly this kind of unraveling before. She hadn't planned to say much, at first, only meaning to mention the toothbrush in the Thursday calendar block almost as a joke, something to laugh off together over the phone. But somewhere in the middle of describing it out loud for the first time to another person, her voice cracked in a way that surprised her, and the whole thing came out at once: the notebook, the midnight laughter through the guest room door, the Sunday morning kitchen scene she still couldn't fully explain away. Grace listened without interrupting until Dana had said everything she needed to say, and then, gently, asked the only question that mattered. Do you actually think something's happening? Or do you think you're just scared something might be? Dana sat with that question longer than she expected to before answering. I think I've known for a while, she finally said. I think I've just been waiting for proof so I wouldn't feel crazy for knowing it. The confirmation she'd been quietly building toward arrived on a Thursday evening she almost didn't act on. Marcus told her he had the logistics review and wouldn't be home until 9. Dana told him to have a good night, kissed him at the door the way she always did, and 20 minutes later, hands shaking slightly on the wheel, got in her car and drove to the address she'd found tucked into a delivery receipt in the guest room recycling bin 2 days earlier. An apartment complex across town, one she'd never once heard either of them mention. She watched Marcus's car pull into the lot 20 minutes later. She watched him walk up to a second-floor unit without checking a phone or hesitating at the door, use his own key without knocking, and let himself inside like it was something he'd done 100 times before, the kind of easy familiarity that takes months, not weeks, to build. Through a narrow gap in the curtains, she watched Simone greet him at the door, warm and unhurried, the way people greet someone they've built an actual life with, rather than someone crashing temporarily in a guest room down the hall from his wife. She sat in that car for nearly 40 minutes before she could make herself drive home. It wasn't shock exactly, sitting there in the dark with the engine off. It was closer to a strange, cold relief, the notebook finally, fully confirmed. The months of small details finally locking into a shape she could no longer talk herself out of. The way a photograph slowly resolves out of static once you finally know what you're looking at. The next morning, while Marcus was at work, Dana called Grace again, and this time the conversation was entirely different, calmer, more deliberate. They spent nearly 2 hours at Dana's kitchen table, going through everything together: the calendar, the receipt, the apartment, the toothbrush that had started it all, building an actual timeline with real dates instead of a scattered notebook full of half-formed suspicions. Grace, listening carefully, took notes of her own the entire time, occasionally asking a clarifying question with the same steady focus she brought to her actual casework, and near the end, she asked one question that changed the direction of everything that followed. Do you want to leave quietly, or do you want him to actually answer for this in front of the people who think he's a good man? Dana thought about it for exactly one night, lying awake in the same bed she'd shared with Marcus for 4 years, staring at the ceiling the way she had so many nights before, except this time the not sleeping felt different, purposeful, instead of anxious. She thought about 4 years of small dishonesties dressed up as convenience, about a guest room she'd painted sage green with her own hands so her mother would feel welcome, now quietly repurposed into something else entirely, a staging ground for a second life he'd apparently been building in plain sight. She thought about the Sunday morning coffee, the calm of it, the practiced ease that only comes with time. And she decided, somewhere around 3 a.m, that quietly leaving wasn't going to be enough, not because she wanted revenge exactly, but because she was tired of being the only person in the story who didn't yet know how it ended. Marcus's company was hosting its annual holiday gala the following month, the kind of event where his entire department, his boss, and half the executive team would be in the same room, an event Simone, as his coworker, would also be attending, seated, according to the table chart Dana glimpsed once over his shoulder, at a table close enough to see and far enough to look coincidental. Dana had been planning to skip it that year, exhausted by months of pretending everything at home was fine. Instead, she RSVP'd yes and started quietly preparing the way she'd once prepared for the guest room, methodically, with far more care than anyone watching her that month would have guessed. Over the weeks that followed, she gathered everything into a single folder. Grace helped her organize printed calendar entries, the delivery receipt with the apartment address, a handful of dated notebook pages, and a short, careful account of what she'd witnessed that Thursday night, written the way Grace had taught her, factual, unemotional, the kind of document that couldn't easily be argued with later. She kept the folder in her car, in the same bag she planned to bring to the gala, and there was something almost calming about having it there, tucked away and ready, the way a person feels calmer, simply knowing where the fire extinguisher is kept. The night before the gala, Grace came over with takeout and made Dana say the words out loud, all the way through, twice, standing in the middle of her own living room, like a rehearsal. Not to make it dramatic, Grace said, but because the first time you say something like that out loud shouldn't be in front of 100 people you barely know. Dana stumbled over it the first time, her voice catching on Simone's name. The second time it came out steady, almost too calm, and Grace nodded once, satisfied, the way a coach nods before sending someone back into a game they'd already decided they were going to win. If everyone in a family believes doubt should be asked directly instead of assumed, what happens when the person doing the deceiving is the one who spent months assuming nobody would ever look closely enough to find out? Marcus was about to learn exactly how closely Dana had been looking, and exactly how long she'd been willing to wait to say so. The night of the gala, Dana got ready with more care than she had in months, choosing a dark green gown she'd bought years earlier for an occasion that had ended up canceled, one she'd never had a reason to wear until now. Standing in front of the mirror, she found herself oddly steady, none of the shaking that had gripped her hands the night she'd driven across town in the dark. Whatever nerves she had left were quiet, folded neatly, under the same composure she'd been practicing for weeks. She arrived beside Marcus looking, by every outward appearance, like a wife perfectly at ease, greeting his coworkers by name, complimenting his boss's wife on her dress, laughing easily at a story one of his colleagues told about a shipping delay gone wrong. Marcus relaxed visibly as the evening went on, the tension of the last few weeks apparently mistaken, in his mind, for nothing more than her being busy with work of her own. Simone arrived separately, seated 2 tables away exactly where the chart had placed her, and Dana caught her eye exactly once across the room during the appetizer course, holding it just long enough to make it clear this wasn't an accident, then looking calmly away again before Simone could decide whether she'd imagined it. Dinner passed in ordinary conversation, the kind of small talk Dana had gotten expert at over 4 years of company events, though she noticed, without quite meaning to, how differently she was hearing all of it tonight. Every warm word said about Marcus by a coworker who had no idea. Every casual mention of how reliable he'd been this year landed on her now with a kind of dark comedy she kept entirely off her face. Near the end of the evening, during a lull between the dinner service and the dancing, Marcus's boss stood to say a few warm words about the team, working his way down a short list of people who'd had a strong year, mentioning Marcus specifically as someone whose dedication this past year had been, in his words, exceptional. All those extra hours, all that late-night commitment nobody had realized was quite so demanding, until he mentioned it out loud. The room raised their glasses. Dana raised hers too, and then, in the quiet that followed the toast, before anyone had a chance to sit back down, she stood. "I'd actually love to say a quick word about that dedication," she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, carrying easily across a room that had gone, almost instantly, very quiet. "Because I know exactly where a lot of those late nights and long Thursdays were spent, and I think Simone does too." She turned towards Simone's table as she said it, and the entire room's attention followed hers, heads turning in a slow ripple from table to table. Marcus's face drained of color in real time, his hand reaching instinctively for her arm. "Dana," he said quietly, a warning underneath it, the kind of tone he'd have used once to soothe her into silence. Dana didn't sit down, and she didn't lower her voice. "I painted our guest room sage green with my own hands, so my mother would feel comfortable when she visits," she continued, calm and clear, each word landing deliberately. "I didn't paint it for a second apartment you two apparently share across town, the one with your key already on his ring. I have the dates, I have the receipts, and I think everyone in this room deserves to actually know what your dedication this year really looked like." The room stayed silent for what felt, to everyone in it, like an unreasonably long time, the kind of silence that has a physical weight to it, the string quartet in the corner, even pausing mid-phrase before quietly stopping altogether. Marcus's boss set his glass down slowly, his expression shifting from confusion into something more careful. A woman 2 seats down from Dana, someone from HR whose name Dana had never quite caught at previous parties, reached over and pressed Dana's hand once, briefly, without a word, the kind of small gesture that somehow said more than anything anyone could have said out loud in that moment. Simone, 2 tables away, went pale, stood, and quietly left before anyone could ask her a single question, though by then, nobody in that room needed her to answer anything at all. Dana set her own glass down gently on the table, picked up her coat from the back of her chair, and turned to leave. Marcus caught her wrist once, quietly, at the edge of the room, out of earshot of most of the guests. "Can we please talk about this at home?" he said, his voice low and pleading in a way she'd never once heard from him before. Dana looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he seemed to think, briefly, that she might actually agree. "There's nothing left to talk about that you didn't already decide months ago," she said, and gently pulled her wrist free. She walked out of the ballroom on her own terms, coat over her arm, leaving Marcus standing in a room full of people who had, 30 seconds earlier, been toasting him. She filed for divorce the following week. Grace, true to her word, walked her through every step of it, and the notebook Dana had once kept out of quiet, private fear became, in the end, exactly the kind of documentation that made the process faster and cleaner than it might otherwise have been, right down to the split of his 401k and the equity in the house. Marcus, for his part, didn't contest much of anything, whether out of genuine guilt or simple exhaustion at having already been exposed so publicly. Dana never fully decided, and after a while, stopped wondering. Word of the gala moved through Marcus's company faster than either of them expected, though Marcus's boss, notably, never mentioned exceptional dedication again in any context Dana ever heard about. Marcus's mother called Dana twice in the weeks after the gala, and when Dana finally called back, expecting some version of defending her son, she was surprised to hear something closer to quiet embarrassment on the other end of the line. "I raised him better than this," his mother said simply, her voice tight. "I'm sorry you had to find out the way you did, and I'm sorry you had to be the one to say it out loud in front of all those people when it should have never gotten anywhere close to that point." Dana thanked her, and meant it. 6 months later, Dana had moved into a smaller apartment entirely her own, one she'd chosen and furnished without asking anyone's opinion first, room by room, at her own pace, in colors she picked simply because she liked them. The guest room in her new place stayed empty for a while, on purpose, until the day she finally painted it again, not sage green this time, but a warm, deliberate yellow, a color she'd simply always liked and had never once gotten around to using in a house that wasn't fully hers. And that's the lesson worth sitting with from this one. The small details you keep explaining away are usually the ones worth writing down. Trust that survives on convenient explanations alone was never really trust to begin with. And the people who count on you not looking closely are almost always the ones who deserve the closest look. If you've ever caught yourself talking yourself out of something you already knew, that instinct was never the problem. It was the only thing in the room telling you the truth. If this story reached something in you, subscribe and turn on that notification bell, because this channel is built on exactly these kinds of stories, and there's always another one waiting.